Energy is essential to life and all living organisms, and to sustain our way of living, we need more and more of it. The big question, where do we get it all from? Of course, directly or indirectly, the source of all available energy on Earth, well, it's the sun. So where better to get the energy to fulfill our needs than from solar? History tells us that in the 7th century BCE, solar energy was used. People used sunlight to light fires with magnifying materials, and later in the 3rd century BC, the Greeks and the Romans were known to harness solar power with mirrors to light torches for religious ceremonies. These mirrors became a normal tool and were referred to as burning mirrors. Chinese civilization documents the use of these mirrors for the same purpose later in 20 AD. Another early use for solar energy that's still popular today was the concept of sunrooms in buildings. The sunrooms used massive windows to direct the sunlight into one concentrated area, and some of the iconic Roman bathhouses, typically those situated on the south-facing side of buildings, were sunrooms. Later in the 1200s AD, ancestors to the Pueblo Native Americans, known as the Anazi, situated themselves on south-facing adobes on cliffs to capture the sun's warmth during the cold winter months. So what I'm saying is that solar, particularly solar thermal, has been with us for centuries. The thing is, we're sporadic. We don't make much use of it, and then we have a huge effort to make a lot of use of it, and then it all falls by the wayside. You have to ask yourself why. Well, I would argue it's because solar is actually trouble. More trouble than easier options, and that's why. The only time we turn to solar is when those easier options become scarce or more difficult than solar. Now, for a very long time, of course, singly, the most important material for construction and energy, well, it was wood. So there was a time when people scoffed at the idea of a shortage of trees, but in the period from Elizabeth I to James I, that's 1534 to 1696, there was an event called the Great Clearance, where people mercilessly chopped down the trees. Why the deforestation? Well, it was the headlong rush into agriculture and industry and the growth of the population. From 1530 to 1690, the population doubled from 3 million to 6 million, and of course a lot of people were rushing into London. At the end of 1690, the population of London was over 500,000 people, and that was a huge demand for construction and fuel. So during this time, the amount of land covered by forest fell to 3.6%, and of course the price of timber rocketed up. Fear of running out of wood, of course, served as a huge impetus for the development of solar power as an energy source. By the 1700s and 1800s, researchers and scientists had had huge success using sunlight to power ovens for long voyages. They also harnessed the power of the sun to produce solar-powered steamboats. Now, it probably culminated with Augustin Mouchot, who demonstrated a solar collector with a cooling engine and made ice cream at the 1878 Universal Exhibition in Paris, and that was quickly followed by the Ericsson engine in 1868. Now, the first installation of solar thermal energy equipment was at Schumann, 1910, when he ran a steam engine from the steam produced by sunlight using parabolic reflectors. Of course, it didn't happen. We turned to coal. Small quantities of coal had been burned in Europe since the 12th century, in areas where it had been accessible from outcropping seams, but medieval craftsmen turned up their noses at coal fires because of the smoke and the fumes it tarnished their wares, and then that all changed. By the time of the Civil War in the 1640s, Londoners depended on coal to heat their homes despite the grime, and coastal shipments grew 20 times between 1550 and 1700. And of course, coal, with improvements in coal technology in the way of burning it and using it, came to dominate the industrial landscape of Britain, and it could arguably be said that coal was one of the main reasons for the success of the Industrial Revolution. Of course, coal continued its dominance until the discovery and widespread use of oil. In the 50s, there was a huge explosion of interest again in solar and solar thermal. Now, my argument is that this only happens when there's a fuel crisis because solar's a pain. So what was the fuel crisis? Well, the war. The war had just ended, and of course all of the production had been sent to the front. Domestic consumption was held back for the war effort, and this continued. Now, at the end of the war, an awful lot of soldiers came back home, and they came back home to a very different world, but they had sacrificed, they had died, and they wanted a home of peace. So there was a huge building campaign, because soldiers were basically living in camps. That building campaign meant that there was a need for energy. The war effort and the recovery from the war effort, while Europe rebuilt itself, meant there was no oil, and that created a fuel crisis from about 1947 through to about 1956, when everybody focused on solar. Solar PV was extremely early stage stuff. People had theorised, but it wasn't until 1916 when the first experimental evidence for the photovoltaic effect was produced, and it wasn't until 1932 when cadmium selenide showed the same effect, and the first solar cell was built by Audebert and Storer. It was in 1954 that the first silicon solar cells were built, and they were only 4% efficient. Solar photovoltaics were in their early stage development and not that much use. Solar thermal, though, it had centuries behind it. And it was in 1947 that Liberty Owens and Ford Glass Company produced a book called Your Solar House, which predominantly was a guide to solar architectures and the use of solar thermal. In 1956 there was a World Symposium of the Practical Use of Solar Energy held in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was reported in the April edition of Popular Mechanics again in 1956. And what they featured were a whole load of solar thermal devices. Things like solar cookers, solar ovens, solar distillation. Solar distillation was by Maria Telkes, and it was produced in the war for the emergency desalination of seawater for downed pilots, and she was reported to have saved many, many lives. She's also credited with the creation of the first solar thermal system using a phase change material, which was Glauber's salt, as it happens. So what happened to it all? Well, nuclear power came along. Nuclear power came along. The oil crisis at the end of the war ceased. Production went back into full swing, and those are so much more convenient and easy than providing our own solar power. Solar as it stood then died a death. Now, you might think with this argument that the next fuel crisis, which was in 1976, would have resurrected solar, and it sort of did. But by this time, of course, solar photovoltaics had made great strides. It was in 1964 that the first solar panel was attached to a space mission by NASA. So solar photovoltaics had a lot of research put into them. Solar thermal, which is a bit more of a pain, and we still had nuclear power in 1976, meant that during 1976 the main resurgence of solar was in solar photovoltaics. In prehistory, we needed power, we turned to solar. We had an energy crisis in the 16th century, we turned to solar. We had an energy crisis in the 20th century, we turned to solar, and now in our energy crisis we're turning to solar. Of course it differs a little bit in that we're turning to solar photovoltaics, and we seem to be forgetting about solar thermal, but solar thermal can contribute a huge amount to the use of solar power. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and please do remember to like and subscribe.